Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Happy Thursday, everybody. One of the big questions China analysts have been asking in recent days is, what does Beijing think about the reports of North Korean troops deployed to Ukraine? A move which connects North Asia to a European war, a move which brings the world one step closer to a more global conflict. On October 17th, Ukrainian President Zelensky warned that 10,000 North Korean troops were set to be deployed to join Russia's fight against Ukraine. Since then, a steady stream of official releases and media reports from South Korea, the United States, and Europe have confirmed the presence of a large number of North Korean soldiers in Russia. Multiple U.S. media reports suggest that the U.S. has been urging China, which maintains a relationship with Pyongyang, to intervene and pressure the North Koreans to pull back. One senior official speaking to UK-based outlet CNN, for example, expressed that the U.S. National Security Advisor Sullivan, quote, directed the U.S. government to engage the PRC and to organize an effort to get other countries to reach out to the PRC as well over concerns about DPRK sending troops into Russia and the implications of that, end quote. Matthew Miller, spokesperson for the U.S. Department of State, similarly expressed, quote, "We've communicated with the PRC about this matter to make clear that we are concerned about it and that they ought to be concerned about this destabilizing action by two of its neighbors, Russia and North Korea." End quote. Officials and analysts are not optimistic that China will intervene with North Korea's plans, however. China's top diplomat Wang Yi met with the Russian deputy foreign minister in Beijing yesterday. In the official readout, there was no mention of the North Korean troops, but rather that they, quote, exchange views on the Ukraine crisis. End quote. 2 days before this meeting, the Russian deputy foreign minister held talks with Liu Xiaoming, China's special representative for Korean Peninsula affairs. According to Russia's foreign ministry, the two expressed concerns over the escalation of tensions in the region, blaming the buildup of military activity by the United States and its allies for frictions. The ministry said Liu and the Russian deputy minister agreed to continue close coordination to, quote, create a fair and indivisible security system, end quote, on the Korean Peninsula, saying that Washington and its allies should, quote, eliminate the risks of a large-scale armed conflict, end quote. It is inconceivable that the North Korean troop situation was not discussed. However, both sides are staying very tight-lipped about it, publicly at least. It is not clear how Beijing feels about all of this either. North Korean troops in a European war brings East Asia very much into NATO's security considerations. Indeed, as the European External Action Service, the EU's diplomatic service, expressed in an official statement this week, quote, the presence of several thousand troops cooperating with the Russian military represents a flagrant violation of the UN Charter and of multiple UN Security Council resolutions. It is a unilateral hostile act by the DPRK with serious consequences for European and global peace and security. End quote. China has been frustrated by the instability Pyongyang sows in North Asia with its nuclear weapons program and its periodic threats to annihilate South Korea. Now North Korea is inflaming a war in Europe, which could deepen a broader confrontation over the global order that pits the United States and its allies against an axis of anti-Western powers led by China and Russia. This is, of course, a story we've been following for some time now. Analysts also argue that another concern China's leadership may have is the exchange of military technology from Russia to North Korea in return for sending troops. That could embolden the North to act more aggressively toward South Korea or Japan, and at the same time diminish Beijing's ability to influence the state, even as it relies on China for trade and aid. However, Victor D. Cha, a professor of government and international affairs at Georgetown University and the Korea chair of the Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington, argues that Beijing may not know how to rein in North Korea's efforts to help the Kremlin, arguing, quote, China is caught between paralysis and incompetence on this. While they are supporting Russia's efforts in the war indirectly, they cannot be happy with the DPRK peace. There is nothing good for them in this, short or long term. End quote. We will end this part with these comments too from veteran China analyst Bill Bishop. Quote, is the PRC trying to pressure the Russians to stop bringing in North Korean mercenaries? Or do they see their presence as useful to aid Russia's victory and ensure Putin's stability? So long as South Korea and NATO do not use the DPRK participation in the European land war as an excuse to make progress on a role in Asia for NATO, what are the downsides for the PRC? South Korea supplying weapons to Ukraine that are used to kill North Koreans in that theater, giving Kim a pretext to do something kinetic on the peninsula? A request for more US weapon systems, maybe even more THAAD for South Korea? End quote. Next up, let's move to something a little lighter. China's biggest electric vehicle maker, BYD, has posted higher quarterly revenues than US rival Tesla for the first time. But a rough, prolonged price war in its domestic market dragged on its profitability. Revenues for the Warren Buffett-backed car maker in the third quarter reached 201 billion yuan, $28.2 billion, surpassing the $25.2 billion sales that Tesla reported last week. BYD sold a record 1.1 million cars in the 3-month period, boosted by a new round of Chinese government subsidies for EVs. However, the sales jump this quarter came at the expense of BYD's gross margins, which slipped from 22.1% last year to 21.9%. Indeed, its profit is still overshadowed by the $2.2 billion Tesla earned. In the first 9 months, BYD had net income of 25.2 billion yuan on revenue of 502.3 billion yuan. BYD and Tesla have emerged as leading threats to legacy automakers, particularly as the latter struggle along the path of profitability with their EV transitions. As growth in consumer demand for fully electric cars wanes, BYD has been insulated more than Tesla due to its strong lineup of hybrid vehicles. As US-based outlet Bloomberg explains this week, Tesla's AI potential and its lead in fully electric vehicle sales has helped cement its place as the world's most valuable automaker. BYD comes in third behind Toyota Motor Co. and ahead of VW, Mercedes, and Detroit's 3 car-making giants. BYD has also benefited from resurgent domestic demand in China, spurred by improved national and local government subsidies aimed at tempting consumers to trade in gas cars for EVs and hybrids. Those local sales have helped cushion BYD against overseas resistance to Chinese car makers' expansion. Indeed, this brings us to our next development. The EU is pushing ahead with tariffs of up to 45% on Chinese electric vehicles, sharply accelerating the trade war between the 27-member bloc and Beijing over allegations of unfair industrial subsidies. Now, before we dive into this story, if you're enjoying today's episode of China Update or getting some value from it, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you have not done so already, subscribe. The algorithm has not been happy with China Update for the last month and a half. I hope that this can be turned around. So if you'd like to see the channel continue, this is a tremendous help. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are also in the description for those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable. Thank you so much. The regulation introducing the levies were published on the EU's official journal on Wednesday. This paved the way for their entry into force later this week after months of negotiations, threats of Chinese retaliation, and auto industry pleas to avoid escalation. The tariffs will be imposed for 5 years and come after the EU rejected China's claims that it was introducing protectionist measures without evidence that Chinese vehicles were receiving undue state support. New duties also come on top of an existing 10% tariff on Chinese car imports in the bloc. Beijing wanted a blanket deal to be applied to all companies through a state-backed Chamber of Commerce, whereas the European Commission preferred to negotiate with individual companies. Negotiations will continue even as the tariffs are in place. This would ensure that any breaches of price undertaking agreements that are reached in the future would automatically trigger the imposition of tariffs. US-based Politico writes that the Chinese government, which regular viewers know very much needs international markets open to take its huge manufacturing surplus, quote, piled on the pressure right up to the death in an attempt to get a deal, end quote. China's Commerce Ministry said in a statement on Wednesday that, quote, it is a protectionist practice that implements unfair competition in the name of fair competition. China does not agree with or accept the ruling results and has filed a case under the WTO dispute settlement mechanism, end quote. UK-based Reuters, in an exclusive report, writes today that China has told its automakers to halt big investment in European countries that support extra tariffs on Chinese-built electric vehicles, a move likely to further divide Europe. 10 EU members, including France, Poland and Italy, supported tariffs in the vote this month. 5 members, including Germany, opposed them, and 12 abstained. China has also threatened to retaliate with penalties of its own on European goods, including dairy, pork and brandy, as well as cars with large engines. China launched an anti-dumping probe into European pork in June, although that has not been finished yet. Some European players are already suffering. Volkswagen has stressed, quote, the urgent need, end quote, for steeper cost cuts after Europe's largest car maker reported a 64% drop in quarterly net profit from a slump in China sales and restructuring charges. During the first 9 months of the year, vehicle sales dropped 12% in China as the group faced competition from local brands. Sales in Western Europe were also down 1%. Indeed, this is part of a wider trend which frames much of the trade dispute. As UK-based The Financial Times writes this week, quote, Europe's automotive industry, which employs nearly 14 million people and accounts for 7% of EU's GDP, is confronting a perfect storm. Demand for cars is falling at home and abroad, while car makers are navigating a risky and expensive multi-year transition from combustion engines to electric propulsion. All these problems are being exacerbated by China, whose competition for sales in the once lucrative domestic market is ferocious, and whose high-quality, low-cost EVs are now being exported to Europe in greater numbers. There are no easy solutions. The EU has followed the US in raising tariffs on vehicles imported from China, but industry leaders say protectionism will only make cars more expensive for consumers and accelerate plant closures in Europe. End quote. The piece argues, quote, the European industry needs to get the Chinese to localize in Europe and needs to collaborate with them, particularly around battery technology, in order to catch up. End quote. This provoked a response from Peking University professor of finance Michael Pettis, who expressed today, quote, that's a pretty distorted reading of what Japan, South Korea and China did to catch up. In fact, they intervened to undervalue their currencies. They lowered interest rates while diverting credit, mainly to infrastructure and the manufacturing sectors. They kept wages from growing in line with productivity, and they often imposed restrictions on imports. If they had merely collaborated in order to improve their manufacturing efficiency, there is no reason why the household share of GDP would have declined to force up domestic savings and set off large, persistent surpluses. End quote. Ultimately, however, it's possible that officials in Beijing will hold off on any escalation in the trade war with the Europeans and opt to wait for the results of the US elections. Henry Gao, a law professor at Singapore Management University who researches Chinese trade and policies, observed this week, quote, the only people more worried about the US election than Americans are the Chinese. Everyone in Beijing is tuned into the US election now. End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you very much, everybody, for watching. Have a good Thursday, and I will see you all tomorrow.